Hello again. Today we're going to take a look at interest groups, which is the PowerPoint that goes along with Chapter 9. So first let's take a look at the nature of interest groups and the role of interest groups. Interest groups are not political parties. Interest groups are groups that seek to influence the making and content of public policy. So they are private individuals like you and I that try to affect the outcome of government, try to affect the content of public policy coming out of our government. So there are some big differences then between interest groups and political parties. And starting with nomination of candidates. Political parties nominate candidates. They have candidates run for office. Those candidates win seats, etc. Interest groups do not do this. If they had a candidate running, they would cease to be an interest group and become a political party. Political parties try to, and their primary focus, try to control government. Interest groups try to control the outcome of government. Political parties' scope of interest has to be wide-ranging, far-flung. They have to be a jack of all trades, a master of none, know a little bit and care a little bit about everything. Interest groups, they focus in on one specific area. They will zero in on that. For example, like the NRA, they're focused on one thing, protecting their view of the Second Amendment, and that's all they'll do. Are they good or bad, interest groups? Well, it depends. It depends on your view and your slant. They do have valuable functions. For example, they stimulate interest in public affairs. They represent people based on shared attitudes rather than geography, so they have a tendency to affect a larger group of people. Construction worker in Pittsburgh has something in common with a construction worker in San Francisco, but they will have different political candidates, and those candidates might not see eye to eye. They organize their interests and offer specialized and detailed information to government, so they can actually be a helpful aid to government in that, if you need a go-to guy on civil liberties, you're going to somebody within the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, which is an advocacy group and an interest group all in one. You're going to go to these areas that have the expertise for sure. They're vehicles of political participation. They get people involved. I know several people in my family that are involved in politics now, in large part due to their membership in the NRA. So, right or wrong, it does get people involved in political participation. And they provide a check and balance in their watchdog feature. They will look at different groups within Congress, within the executive branch, and if they step out of line, these interest groups they'll blow the whistle. They'll let people know, so they create a check and balance in keeping political groups and their power in check. Now, there can be some criticisms. That a lot of times these groups have a greater influence than their membership warrants. If you have a small group with a lot of money, they can have a very large influence. It is hard to tell how many members each group has because they're not required to keep detailed records on membership. Very often they're operated by a small minority of people. Even large groups, there's only a small group of people at the top of that organization making the decisions and controlling which way the group works. And in some groups do use, I'm sure today still, some very undemocratic tactics such as bribery, threats, revenge, etc. There's all kinds of different types of interest groups, and we'll try to go through these relatively quick. There's economic groups that are mostly founded and based around some sort of economic interest or business. There's groups that are out there that fight for a cause or idea. And then there are some that are set up to just promote the general welfare of a group of people, for example, various veterans associations. So let's look at some economic interest groups. Business groups look to government to protect and promote their interests. Notable big business groups are NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers, and the Chamber of Commerce. There's also trade associations out there like the American Bankers Association. That's a trade. You learn how to bank on the job. They have internal banking type schooling. Yeah, some of the leadership and management go through finance, but the bankers, the ones that are working the tellers and such, that's a trade. So they have the American Bankers Association for those. Trucking is also a trade. So you have the American Trucking Association, etc. Labor unions also would exist as a interest group with economic interest. These are organizations of workers who share the same type of job or work in the same industry. Notables here, you have the AFL-CIO, which is the American Federation of Labor, and the Congress of Industrial Organizations. They joined in the 1930s to form the largest conglomerate of unions in the United States. Farming groups also serve economic interest. These are groups that focus, as I said, primarily on farming. Some notables here are the National Grange, American Farm Bureau, and the National Farmers Union. Both of these groups are typically pretty conservative. The National Grange, for example, is absolutely a conservative group which backs right-leaning mostly Republican politicians in their interests and groups. There are professional groups that help serve professional businesses and occupations that require extensive specialized training, such as medicine, law, and education. Some notables here would be your American Medical Association for doctors, American Bar Association for lawyers, and the National Education Association for teachers. Next, we'll take a look at the groups that promote causes and ideas. The American Civil Liberties Union is a very big interest group that promotes a cause, and that would be to fight court battles to protect civil and political rights. This is typically a left-leaning group, but they do protect all civil rights across the board. If a conservative group is having their civil liberties or their rights threatened, the ACLU will defend them because it's a civil liberty. And a loss of one man's civil liberties is a threat of a loss to all men having civil liberties, and men and women. No offense intended there. The National Rifle Association fights to protect the Second Amendment rights to bear arms. So this is typically a right-leaning group, but it's also a group that's been around for a long time and will continue to be around because they promote a cause or an idea. And as we mentioned before, with political groups and political parties, people don't tend to change their ideas and their beliefs very quickly. So these groups based on ideas and beliefs, they tend to be pretty long-lasting. Groups that promote the welfare. You have groups, as I mentioned, that were veterans associations like the American Legion, Veterans of Foreign Wars. These groups work to advance the interest of veterans. The AARP works to advance the beliefs and the welfare of elderly. And in the NAACP, of course, fight for minority rights and have been doing so for about 100 years there as well. So what do interest groups do? What do they look like at work? Interest groups are largely responsible for propaganda. Now, propaganda is something that when I hear from my extensive history training, and you guys may think this as well from your 11th grade history, your 10th grade history. When you hear propaganda, you probably think of the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, fascist Italy during World War II, and it has a negative connotation, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. Propaganda itself is nothing more than trying to influence public opinion. It doesn't necessarily have to be for sinister or evil purposes. Interest groups then use propaganda regularly. This is their main tool, their device for trying to influence public opinion and attempting to get their message out to the public, right? So propaganda is a technique of persuasion that attempts to influence individuals or a group of behavior. As we can see here in this World War II propaganda campaign poster from the United States, it was, obviously trying to encourage Americans to make sure that they show up and give 100% at work, because if not, the Japanese would be happy for them to take the day off because it would give them the advantage in the war. So how do they influence political parties? Involvement in interest groups often encourages members to get involved in party affairs, to show up to vote, to go out and talk to people about voting, etc. Political action committees can be formed. This is a a relatively recent phenomenon we've seen since the 90s really kind of proliferate and get big. PACs, as they're called, raise and distribute money to candidates sympathetic to their cause or their interest group. So, there's going to be, you have a big group like the ACLU, there's probably going to be a political action committee that spawns off of it. A big group like the NRA, there's going to be a political action committee that spawns off of it. And what they do is they actively get involved in raising money and campaigning for specific candidates. Lobbying is an activity by which a group tries to pressure legislators in the legislative process. This is where they show up, ask for meetings, talk with our elected officials on Capitol Hill, and try to really affect the political process as it's playing out. What makes a good lobbyist is knowing the legislative system through and through, and very often your most effective lobbyists in D.C. are past legislators, representatives, senators that have either retired or lost their seats. They pick up jobs in lobbying firms to try and influence politicians on behalf of these interest groups. All interest groups try to stake claim to being grassroots. This is a vocab word you should be familiar with, and it means to of and by the people. Okay, so starting, within the people, not with a big pile of money somewhere and a big group of rich people, but amongst the masses. There is some regulations to lobbying. Federal Regulation of Lobbying Act of 1946 said that lobbyists have to register with the clerk of the House and the Secretary of the Senate if their principal purpose is to influence legislation. So this is just to keep a list of who's in and out of Washington, who's talking to your representative, who's talking to your senator, and it gives us a sense of transparency. This law was largely ineffective, though, because it does not apply to the lobbying of congressional aides or executive officials. So, we talked about earlier that over 90% of all laws, their ideas come from the executive branch. So if you want to influence the outcome of government, one thing you could do would be to lobby the Justice Department if you want to set laws to come out and in favor of something that your interest group finds favorable. So to kind of try and close up some loopholes, the Lobbying Disclosure Act of 1995 removed the principal purpose clause. So now that everybody who talks with one of our elected officials on Capitol Hill has to sign in, they must register whether it is their principal purpose to lobby or not. I believe that concludes this PowerPoint. Thanks for watching. Good luck.